Hello RGL3000 students, Dr. Conway here to talk to you about Lesson 5, the importance of research design. This shouldn't take very long, but it's an important topic for more than just one reason. Firstly, it's important because to get a proper research project done, you have to design it at the front end to make sure you're thinking through all of the issues that go into that research project. The second major purpose for a research design when you're dealing in the area of regulation is that you use the research design document to build consensus with major stakeholders about how a research project is going to go forward to determine whether a regulation is worth doing, and if it is worth doing, is the regulation design going to be the proper design, and so forth. So answering a lot of the political questions related to a regulation. And the reason that you build consensus around the research design before you do the research is so that you avoid the problem of being in a stakeholder meeting or a public consultation forum and people raising their hands, say industry groups or whatever, and saying, we didn't agree to that, or we didn't understand that was what it was all about, or do you realize you missed this huge chunk of information related to the issue, or whatever. When you do a research design and you actually circulate that to stakeholders before you begin the research, you build consensus about what the research is going to be. So if there are any questions about the findings when the research project is done, they're not about the legitimacy of the project and the buy-in on the project, because that was done at the research design stage, but rather then they become more technical questions about whether the data was analyzed the right way or whatever. Those you can handle, those you can make adjustments for. But once a full research project is done and there's fundamental problems with the methodology or the stakeholder buy-in, then you've got yourself a major problem, because some of these research projects can be very expensive and just can't be redone willy-nilly. Okay, so let's look at some of this, and like I say, this shouldn't take very long. The slides are fairly self-explanatory on this question. But one thing that drives this, as I said, is that socioeconomic research of any size, particularly large nationally based projects that are looking at a regulatory question across an entire country, can be quite costly and time consuming to undertake. So it's foolhardy to begin any kind of a research project of that scale without a research design in advance, okay? And presumably, or preferably, a research design that you've gotten major stakeholders to buy into, okay? Because then that becomes, it sort of reduces the risk of the analyst in terms of the political dynamics of the process once findings from the study start to emerge. And then research design, of course, will be heavily influenced by the type of problem you're investigating or the type of issue you're investigating and the type of research methods you use. And so laying that clearly out in the research design document before you begin builds consensus across a number of things. You know, what data do we need? Where is it located? How are we going to collect it? Do we need people, industry or others, to agree to share the information? Once we have the information, how's it going to be analyzed? What are we expecting to find out through these forms of analyses, whether it be correlation or multiple regression or any number of different statistical measures? You know, do we agree that we should use these as statistical measures? Should we consider using others? And if you know the findings emerge out of that, if you've got sign off on all of these steps in the research design phase, then the people have a lot less to dispute at the back end. The facts are the facts. You signed off on the research design document. We implemented it accordingly, and here are the findings. It's that simple. Okay. But, you know, a lot of things goes into research designs, right? What knowledge claims are being made by the research? In other words, what are we after and what are we going to find out if we follow this research design? Okay, what strategies of inquiry will inform the research? Where are we going to get the data? Who has it? How are we going to collect it? How are we going to analyze it? Do we need sign-offs? Do we need agreement from people to get the data because it's commercial data? How are we going to handle commercial data, etc.? All of those factors become important. And then what methods of data collection and analysis will be used? Getting sign-off on all those things before a major study is done is a critical issue that can save an analyst, it can save an entire regulatory process a lot of difficulties and potentially a lot of embarrassment, okay? So the research design document reviews and reaffirms the internal logic of the study in one place before time and money is invested, and proceeding with data gathering and analysis. If the analyst cannot document the analysis framework clearly at the early stages and explain it to key stakeholders and get their buy-in, then further time is needed to design the study or to build political consensus around the need for the study and the direction the study will go. If you don't have that, you go into consultations on a regulation down the road, and you're using data that major stakeholders dispute or never signed on to, you have a hugely additional complexity that you have to deal with. So we're building consensus on the approach with key stakeholders. The intermediate consultation stage with stakeholders is highly recommended to diffuse problems. So in other words, you do the research design document, you send it out to major stakeholders, and sometimes you're even having a working group with the major stakeholders on how this is going to unfold. None of that can take place until a solid research design document is produced, okay? Now, in that research design document, you're going to be dealing with different types of research methodologies, okay? I mean, we do know that in cost-benefit analysis terms, which we have to do for a medium to high-impact regulation, a cost-benefit is needed. That requires monetization. But that's a form of quantitative research. We have we break it out into monetization, quantification, and qualification. But that has to be laid out clearly in the guidance document or in the design document, research design document, so that people understand what data is going to be collected, how it's going to be collected, how it's going to be analyzed. If we can't monetize certain data, how are we going to quantify it? If we can't quantify it, what role is it going to play in the study, perhaps qualitatively? And you're building consensus about all those things as you roll forward. Qualitative research, very straightforward, right? It's what we do when we write a normal essay. But it's also the type of data or information we provide to provide context and background to the monetary and quantitative data that we may be able to collect in a research design. So how is monetization going to work in the study? How is quantification going to work in the study? How are we going to qualify our data? How are we going to describe everything? What are the key sections that are going to convey the types of messages that we need to convey? And these, most regulation studies are what we call mixed method. They try to monetize where they can. Where they can't monetize, they try to quantify. And of course, qualification is always needed to provide context, to provide background, to describe the problem, to all of those things that go into regulatory socioeconomic studies are usually mixed methods that pull on monetization, which for us is the highest order of data, quantification, and qualification, okay? And all of this is key because data collection and analysis is often the most exacting and expensive part. Remember I described to you on the Sub-Saharan Africa pesticide project, we did a research design. We circulated literally to all the major international agencies for consultation. We take their comments on, we revise, we send it back out and say, if there isn't major concerns, we're rolling forward. They all sign off or they all don't send an email. And if they indicate that they support it, mostly, then it rolls forward. And then so once, if at a controversial project like that Sub-Saharan African project, when the findings come back, they can start to nitpick on how we analyze the findings or various things, but they can't disagree fundamentally with the methodology anymore because they already signed off on that. So a major political dynamic is diffused by a proper research design at the very beginning. Not only that, but when you have a proper research design, an expensive data collection exercise like that project was, literally having to hire researchers in every one of the countries, give them a budget, give them months of research, require reports. It costs a lot of money to do that, all right? And because it costs a lot of money, not doing it on the basis of a research design is completely unacceptable, okay? And so this issue, it's very important for students to understand that a research design is not just something you get over to do a project. It's something that builds a lot of consensus behind the project early on before you potentially get in trouble into data collection phase and data analysis phase. And so that's why we put so much emphasis into the research design. And the research design also speaks to what major sources of data will be involved in the research. And we know there are wide ranges of different types of data sources. The most common used in regulatory studies are official statistics, okay? Those are statistics that are produced by governments and international agencies all the time at hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of expense. Enormous amounts of data, for example, are produced by the Government of Canada every quarter and certainly every year. And we spend hundreds of millions of dollars in data collection from Statistics Canada, Canada Mortgage and Housing, labor boards, indigenous communities, you name it. There's amazing volumes of data produced by governments nationally, particularly developed governments, obviously, that have the budget, but also the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, UN agencies, NATO. All of them produce enormous amounts of official statistics. And the advantage of official statistics is that those have already been vetted. So the researcher doesn't have to spend a lot of time vetting those. They have to spend time understanding how the government classifies the data and how they vetted it. But you don't have to do all that vetting itself because governments will not release data that they have not always vetted. Does that lead to sometimes governments, not revealing some data or having rather sort of narrow or liberal interpretations of data to suit political dynamics of the day? Yes, of course. All government data, to some extent, has to be analyzed by the researcher to determine its appropriateness for your study. But still, the enormous resource of official statistics is always going to be a part of almost all regulation studies. In very specialized areas, for example, how people prefer certain types of products over others, or marketing information, or so on, you can go to privately held data sets. There are many, many companies out there that's their business. They collect specialized data sets for selling to clients, selling to companies that want to find things out. How do people feel about not being able to turn right on a red light? How do people feel? There are companies out there that generate and maintain huge special data sets targeted to specific niche aspects of the market. There are many companies, for example, that provide data to auto producers and equipment manufacturers and farm equipment manufacturers, and you name it, billion-dollar industries. And these guys, they just specialize on maintaining privately held data sets at a very high quality and a very high level of detail, for which they spend millions of dollars collecting that data, and then they get it back by selling that data to marketing organizations or companies who want that data. Another version of that, of course, is what we know now as social media big data, okay? Big data analysis from Google, Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, Snapchat, etc., who collect huge volumes of data, massive volumes of data that can be synthesized or can be siphoned down to topics that are of particular interest to you. Like, how do people feel about using cell phones in cars? How many people do that? Can we tell? Because these data sets can tell. They know where your cell phone is, and they know if you're in your car, if you have Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. They have all kinds of things, all kinds of ways of siphoning the data to determine, a research question you might have because of a regulatory concern to address a harm. Then, of course, there's just simple primary research, right? These are research institutes that do studies on an ongoing basis, or universities or labs or colleges that do research on things, and they release them as primary research papers or discussion papers or white papers or whatever. Lots of really good information can be found in those, right? Which are not the traditional academic publishing route, right? Where you write a book and you go through the University of Toronto and 2 years later it comes out. These are primary research documents released by research institutes, academic centers, these kinds of things, right? Or even, specialized specialized journalist reports, any kinds of things like that. And then secondary research, of course, is what go after, like your typical student research paper. You're looking at published articles, published books, magazine articles, newspaper articles that have already been published, and your use of them is secondary, which is why we call it secondary research. Okay. And then, of course, there's all kinds of self-generated data sources. I mean, things that researchers do. They can run experiments. They can do observation studies. You know, when you go into, sometimes in the summertime when you're driving your car, you'll see two students sitting on the corner with clipboards taking notes. They're doing observation data. How many cars took a right turn at this corner as opposed to going straight or going left? Why? Because they're thinking about doing some structural improvement to the road system in there. So the city hires them to collect observation data, basically. Okay. Survey instruments, we all know about those. Those are polls, those are consumer surveys where they call you on the phone or they get you to fill something out over the internet, or somebody comes to your door and asks you 3 or 4 questions, or you're in a mall and somebody stops and says, would you mind, sir or ma'am, to answer 4 or 5 questions for me? And we have a $10 certificate for such and such if you do. You know, this kind of stuff, survey instruments. And then what's used a lot in marketing and politics, of course, is focus groups, right? Where you get a small group into a room and you do intensive questioning of that group. How do you feel about X? Or how do you feel about Y? Or if you had to choose between X and Y, what would be the criteria you would use to choose that? Or whatever the case may be, all right? So you can see that through these data generating techniques, a lot of if it's a large scale research project for a regulation, like you're trying to determine how genetic engineering should be regulated in a different way. This is not research that's done on a buck and a half and a coffee over a weekend. These can be extensive research projects that can be very expensive. The government can spend $2-3 million on a study like this, or at the least probably $500,000 or $600,000 on a study like this. So it's expensive to collect the data. So you have to have the research design in place. And then even when you have the data, you have that additional exercise, and your research design should talk about that. How are you going to evaluate the results of your data sources? How are you going to make sure there's not duplicate data points or erroneous data points? Or the data has been stored in a confused way and you interpreted it wrong. You'd be amazed the amount of difficulties. You would think the data would all be standardized between levels of government. We would all understand it the same way. It would be stored the same way. It would be, all those things. And then you quickly get into a big project and you realize, you know what? There's 10 governments here and 3 of them are doing this way, 3 of them are doing that way, and the rest of them are doing it that way. And now we have to figure out how to make all those data sets work together. It's enormous, particularly when you're dealing with big data, where they have programs now at colleges and universities. Just how do you set up big data for analysis? And it's called big data analysis. And so all of these things come into play, and all that needs to be set out in your research design at the front end. Why? Because if you collected all that data and you're not confident that you can use it, or more importantly, you cannot convince major stakeholders that you've used that data properly, you're going to have yourself a significant problem. Okay? So on that, I just wanted to go through that. The slides are fairly self-explanatory on this question. But we do need to cover research design, because if you're in a government context and you're doing a large study, the research design has to be extremely well thought out for those 2 purposes: to make sure that resources devoted to the study are used very effectively and efficiently, but also to build stakeholder buy-in and consensus. All right? On that score, I'll let you go. No Zoom call this week. We will pick it up again next time. All right? Take care, gang. Have a good week. Bye-bye now.